So the question is, at what scale do we act? And so today we're going to talk about two different scales. We're going to talk about the scale of infrastructure in cities and talk about the scale of buildings. And I'm sure that people in the room and people at the conference are making differences at both scales. So this scale of infrastructure is what I'm going to talk about. And I want to start with this story. I think all of us in small cities are used to kind of looking at lists. You know, we follow the listicles to see where does our city rank in different things. And we picked up this report. It's a research report by a real estate company ranking which are the most resilient cities in the world, and never expected to see anything that we outside of the normal global cities. But lo and behold, Pittsburgh is number 5, just after Chicago. And we said, wow, that's unexpected. But let's dig into what this means. And so resiliency in the Grosvenor report is defined as the ability of a city to avoid or bounce back from an adverse event. And they define it by looking at aspects related to vulnerability and adaptive capacity. And when you look at what those two terms mean, vulnerability tends to be focused on place-based things, and adaptive capacity is focused on governance. And so in thinking about resiliency, it's really important to think about place, the combination of place and governance. Oftentimes too, we get focused on the word of resiliency as bouncing back. And as those of us who have gone through extreme transitions in our city life, our city structure, we know that in some cases, resiliency is not about adaptability, being able to bounce back, but it's about the transformability, being able to bounce forward into a new system when the old system is no longer viable. So this really points to, yes, technology is important, and we need to continue to make technological innovation a focus of what we work on. But we also need to think very strongly about community formation. And that can mean community in the sense of a neighborhood, or community in the sense of an organization or a collaboration. And we started this work back in 2011, 2012, looking at cities where they were deemed shrinking cities. And shrinking cities are easy to see what happens when, let's say, population leaves and urban systems decline. But oftentimes those cities are working actually through a pivot. And we realized that shrinking cities are not just in a certain region or a certain area, but every part of the nation has aspects of that in the neighborhoods, in cities. Cities are constantly being rejuvenated. And so this is really important work to be applied across every place that we know. I'm going to talk to you about a community called Larimer. It's spelled Larimer, but it's said Larimer. And it's a neighborhood within the city of Pittsburgh. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about their story. So in 1940, Larimer was a very lively place. It had a commercial and a kind of light scale urban industrial district. That's the purple areas. And the rest of it was a residential area. In 1940, things were booming, but by 1975, the population had dwindled by half. By 1995, again, the population was cut by half, down to 3,000. And in 2011, when we worked with them, they were a little, it says the official number was 2,000, but there was probably about 11 or 1,200 people in the community. Now, this is pretty difficult for folks to go through, and there's a lot of kind of social trauma that comes with the kind of devolution of city systems. And I want to point out that this school, that you see this image of, will play a part of the story later. So we worked with the community, the Larimer Consensus Group, the Kingsley Association, to think about what their future could be, and talked about things like stabilizing, like consolidating resources, whether that be vacant lots or whether that be human resources, growing, and how one can create economic security, and diversifying to increase resiliency. And then finally, when you get to a condition of stability, how do you sustain that stability? How do you maintain vibrancy in these communities? So if I put these two diagrams side by side, One thing you'll notice that the diagram of 2035 is far more colorful and vibrant than 1940. I want to say that what urban systems were considered in 1940 was, land use or, in service to larger regional systems. If you bought food, it came from somewhere else. If you were, looking at where your water came from, your sewer systems, et cetera, it was part of a larger regional system. And what the community imagined here was the ability to be able to close loops for decentralized systems and to really kind of make and create, consume and recycle and regenerate within, if not within the boundaries of the neighborhood, then certainly kind of smaller sets of systems. So you have things like urban farms and parks, energy production on or near the site, water capture, etc. And one of the things about this kind of planning is that when you're thinking about 2035, that's really, really far away. You have to plan for multiple different types of futures. It's never just one future, it's multiple futures. And that's important to equip people that we work with to change the way that we think about design. And so we often talk about urban design or the creation in neighborhoods and cities with land use, and we might talk about open space or mixed use, and we'll talk about connectivity. And those are all really important things that will continue to play a role. But in order to kind of transition to thinking about eco-districts, we need to talk about the resources and flows that move through a site. And so what is the performance of that system? How do we assign value to ecological processes? And how do we take into account social equity at all these different scales that we might be discussing? So environmental systems depend on physical infrastructure, but they also depend on social infrastructure. And eco-districts allow us to have that conversation. They're holistic models of sustainability planning. And really, it empowers people to take ownership over their individual and collective futures. So it's very concerned with how a community sees itself, how it functions together, and how it relates to its infrastructure. So we talk about eco-districts as focusing both on the hardware or physical systems of a place, as well as the software, which sounds remarkably like how that report defined resiliency. So we did a little thought experiment, looked at all the past plans that had been thought about for this community, and kind of put all the strategies out there and said, how do you begin to understand all these things that you do in a community? They're all great, all these kind of sustainability strategies. And we said that for each of these systems, though, there's a kind of optimal scale or scales for that system to function effectively. For instance, anybody can change a light bulb or plant a garden, and they should. But in order to work as a city or a community, it needs to be kind of aggregated to get to a larger scale, but perhaps not as large as the scale that it had been functioning before. Decentralization is now more possible, and in many cases more resilient than some of the larger systems. So when you look at some of these things, they take more time and they are larger scale, they take more capacity. And so we look at what the community capacity is to relate to these systems. So how does a community make decisions? How do they transfer knowledge or learn together? Do they have legal structure to act, and do they get financial resources? Most communities start with financial resources. If we only had money, that'd be great. However, in order to get that, you have to have these other three things in place to function effectively. And if you think about when communities are up against development that they may or may not embrace, developers and oftentimes agencies have pretty high capacity. They can make decisions, they can learn well, they transfer knowledge, they have legal structure and financial resources, and there's an asymmetry when it comes to communities in these areas. So in this case, when we're working on a process, the race is really the prize. The plan is important, the end result is important, but the capacity of the community to continue down a line to reach their goals becomes an equal design problem. So in thinking through how this works, we begin with questions, and they have to be big questions. How can energy independence make a community more resilient? Place is really important, and how we might design things to embrace these systems and to demonstrate these systems and to function in these systems. but so is performance. In this community, we asked, what would it take to make a net zero community? It would take actually 40 acres of photovoltaics and 63 acres of commercial photovoltaics to deal with the residential and commercial loads. And when you look at the actual pattern of the community, those squares or those areas, there's actually not enough rooftops. You're really looking at a kind of utility scale to make that possible. So we're looking at interim opportunities for generation and interim technologies as we continue to look for opportunities to make net zero contributions. You look at projects, and this is the part that people focus most often on, but it has to be paired with these other big picture ideas. You look for opportunities when a school comes up for renovation where you can do things like geothermal or solar, leveraging public infrastructure. Look for where new things are being built and amplify the standards and also incentivize above and beyond performance. And of course, you have to look at the existing fabric to understand where you can do where certain technologies can benefit the systems and the people who are already in place and knit it back into the community fabric. Likewise, we looked at food systems. What is the character of place, and how does it not just represent a kind of beautiful area or kind of spatial typology, but how does it represent different ways of working together? What is the performance that should be targeted for this? In this case here, taking the Living Building Challenge and looking at how we might meet some of those requirements for on-site food production at the scale of a neighborhood. And then really importantly, how does it play out with the patterns of the site? Where do you have opportunities to do certain things that you have to connect the dots and make sure those resources and flows work together? And then taking it back down to the project. Things get done by project scale, and so you have to bring it back down to a project scale setting. So the last one that I'll share with you is water, and how does water become an asset, not a liability, was an abstract but important question for this community when we started. And we looked at place and what the opportunities were to make interesting places relative to water, and what performance we needed to get to a net zero aspect for every community member there today and every community member in the future. We looked at what opportunities there were because we knew we had things like stormwater overflow problems to solve and upcoming infrastructure investments, something that most cities are dealing with. We looked at policy scale of how different things get enacted in different places, how a residential area might benefit from certain policies and incent water streets or public realm improvement, while say the larger scale developments or even the light industrial might be more site-based or development-based infrastructure. And lastly, we looked at different projects, again, kind of looking at this area to say, where is there large-scale infrastructure improvements planned? How do we, or building projects planned, how do we take a part of that performance and apply it to that site? And how do we weave it back into the systems of the community? Well, while doing this, tragically, just downstream, we had a disaster that was very powerful to us and the team to understand the importance of our work. And this site that we had kind of imagined as part of that process here, which is now a kind of, has storage warehouses because it's not a great site, and it's less than perfect for occupancy. But really, when you look at the ecological pattern, it wants to be a water storage place. It wants to be a wetlands and had indeed been a wetlands before. So as we begin to integrate the right solutions in the right places, integrate ecological systems, we have the ability to make change if we can get there fast enough. And that takes us to the point of, how do we get this to scale? How do we get this to scale? Can design really change a system or systems? We have physical scales, time scales, scales of influence, as Marc said. Let's talk about these to say, how does a community leverage so much more? Well, in Larimer, they were able to get a number of different, I'll take water systems. They were able to get a number of different infrastructure built, anything from kind of top of the line green infrastructure at Google's headquarters to a water utility park for the community. They were able to leverage larger grants like the Army Corps of Engineers to look at centralized systems, still decentralized from the larger regional system, but how to keep that water and those resources closer to the places that they originate and how to weave development into that. This idea influenced things way beyond the community, including getting those principles included in Pittsburgh's Water and Sewer Authority's EPA compliant Green First plan for green infrastructure, which then Buffalo Sewer Authority wanted to emulate in their Rain Check 2.0 plan. And it didn't just emulate, or it didn't just influence upstream, it influenced on the ground, where the Kingsley Association, a good community partner, is invaluable, leveraged over $3 million in volunteer hours, trained energy auditors, helped people understand how to start micro businesses around this, and has been able to carry forth this into the lives and the living of folks on the ground. One of the most concrete ways that they leveraged this was to inform their Choice Neighborhoods Initiative development, and to get that $30 million that then leveraged $401 million with various infrastructure, public and private investments. And so affordable housing remains on the site, even maybe more than it had been prior. And eco-districts influenced across the city all levels of neighborhood planning, from large scale, what we call tabula rasa, new developments on brownfield sites, to weaving it into existing neighborhoods, what we call quilted districts in the uptown neighborhood, influenced through city code, zoning code, and codes applying to master plans. So the last one I'll just say is kind of how the ideas catch fire and how it creates influence and learning networks much broader. A borough called Millvale was interested in this and took on, through two plans, a Pivot 1.0 plan and a Pivot Ecodistrict Pivot 2.0 plan, some great ideas that were appropriate to their community. And that's a whole nother presentation. But to say that they caught on to things, started looking at things like air quality and food systems, and really began, and through projects and through these larger scales, to put these pieces of the system in place. Their neighbor Sharpsburg said, neighboring borough of Sharpsburg said, this is interesting. We have flooding problems. We have other issues. Let's see how it applies to us. And lastly, their neighboring borough, Etna, said the same thing and took on a planning process that looked at how these things might apply to their municipality. Together, these three municipalities formed the Tri-Borough Eco-District and influenced the formation of a citywide organization to help municipalities or neighborhoods talk about eco-districts, and that's called District PGH. But working with the ecodistricts.org organization and the Ecodistricts protocol, they actually influenced what was included in the Ecodistricts protocol, and ultimately they became the first 3 certified ecodistricts in the world. That wasn't the point of what they were chasing, but the certification became a validation that what they were doing was recognized by others as being important and being stringent, to be honest. So eco-districts, Marc's going to talk about living buildings. The eco-districts in Larimer was influenced and inspired by the Living Building Challenge, and Millvale is coming full circle, doing a living building and looking at the Living Communities Challenge. So the use of frameworks is a jumping off point. It's also an ending point and can be very important. So we need to think in systems, and eco-districts are a great way to begin the conversation. And Marc's going to jump scale and talk about buildings.
Thanks, Christine. So yeah, I'm going to bring it down to the building scale, but I think what Christine has done is give a really good context for what this can become. And a living building can be noteworthy enough to be a generator of ideas and discipline. So this slide is taken from the ILFI. A lot of sustainability talking is about how can we just do less bad? How can we just not do as bad as conventional? And what living buildings try to do is make it that it's actually a restorative path. And this is done by means of looking at absolute goals of sustainability. How can a building be a net energy producer? How can the water coming out be cleaner than the water going in? How can we not use any materials that are toxic for human health? And so these are the aspirations of the living building. So when we take a look at a building itself, we took a look at the time scale as well. And if you work your way from the site, which has been around, of course, for millions of years, but maybe in a more concrete way, maybe there's been legal overlays, or maybe it has a production benefit of some kind. So maybe we're looking at a scale of hundreds of years. Then the structure of the building, that's going to last a while, 60 to maybe 100 years. Then the building skin, which is a little less durable, but also very long lasting. Then the building services, HVAC systems, then the space plan, and then the things inside, so the furniture and things like that. So there's a direct taxonomy of the things that are inside. Like if you look around yourselves right now, the furniture that you're sitting around is going to ugly out way before it uglies out, way before it wears out. So therefore, a lot of things that you have around you are going to change in 5-10 years, and that's expected. But if you look around at the bigger things, working your way all the way into the system, those are more durable. So we have to think in terms of that time scale when we're working with buildings. The other aspect is the way buildings are delivered. You have the inception, then you have the design, then you have the construction, and there's many ways to deliver that. But the idea is that once construction is done, there's this magical handoff to the owner, at which point the design and construction team is basically disincentivized from hanging around and learning more about the building. And meanwhile, then the owner and the O&M team come in and start operating the building. So with that, then there are different frameworks we can apply as to how to make better buildings. Living Building Challenge, like I said, is an absolute type of system where we look at different imperatives. There's LEED, which of course is the kind of the gold standard as far as global green building rating system goes. I'm not saying it's the best, but it is the most prevalent across the world. It's being used in 160 countries. Our firm have worked on hundreds of LEED certified projects, and it's a very good system because it allows you to really plug in all of the different strategies and goals that you might want for a project, from design, construction, operations, and maintenance. Passive House is emerging as a very key way to deliver buildings. Also very simple, simple goals, hard to achieve. But the idea is that if you make a very tight envelope, you can minimize your mechanical systems and make a better building that's more durable. And WELL certification, the idea of wellness has come around. We've always known about it, but as a codified system, I think this has only been around since 2016. And so it really has had an impact. Rather than looking at the building and saying, okay, what impact is this having on the environment? The question is more, what impact is this having on human health and the people inside? Energy Star keeps track of building performance and benchmarks it. So this is a good way to know where your building should be situated. And then when you have on the existing building side, aside from Energy Star, LEED for existing buildings is also a really good way to look at how to make that building work well. After all, 85% of a building's impact is going to occur during operations and maintenance. We make a lot of fuss about the design and the construction, rightly so, but all in all, that's just a couple years compared to a 60, 80, 100-year life cycle of a building. So when you take a look at how to deliver a building, that green line there shows the opportunity to have meaningful impact, and that diminishes over time, the same way that it's hard to make a change as the building goes. That's where the blue line comes in. Over time, it's more and more difficult and costly to make any changes. So if you look at this graph, it stands to reason that you want to make all of your meaningful decisions as far left as you can up front. And the idea here is to make your meaningful decisions early. Hence the idea of the goal setting charrette and the idea of selecting a suitable framework. The way we approach that is by looking at the project goals, which we tie to the project or the client vision and mission. So whether it's a football team or whether it's a nonprofit or whether it's a healthcare system or a higher ed institution or Mr. and Mrs. Jones that want to do a renovation. You have these goals and then you try to customize sustainability strategies to apply to that. So the idea here is if you can start early. Now we're here to talk about the Living Building Challenge. And we're up to LBC 4.0 now. The projects, I'm going to show you two projects. One it was 1.0, the other was 2.0. But the beautiful thing about Living Building Challenge, this was, without getting too much into the genesis of it, the idea was, okay, what's beyond LEED? And so back in 2006, a couple talented people, Bob Berkervall and Jason McLennan, took on that challenge to crystallize what makes a building achieve absolute sustainability goals with regards to water, with regards to energy, with regards to materials, with regards to energy, did I say energy? Sorry, beauty, and then health and happiness. And so the idea here is that you have these principles that you can work towards, and they're all prerequisites. So unlike LEED, which is more of a relative rating system where you get it or you don't get it, you get points if you do more of it, but you don't have to. Here, there really is no room for error, which I'm sure you can all appreciate. It's more difficult to achieve. First project I want to talk to you is occurred in Pittsburgh. It's the Frick Environmental Center. It's part of the Pittsburgh Public Parks system, and so it's actually free admittance if you ever get the chance to go. Here was the team, the architect, Bolin Sawinski Jackson, which is a notable national firm, as well as other talented folks here. And the idea here was that this was an old alley. Frick Park is one of the grand old parks of Pittsburgh, which has a lot of grand old money. And so you had a couple gatehouses to the left, and to the right was a fountain. So you had this alley flanked by these trees. And to the bottom is the actual site of the building. It slopes downwards, so it's naturally south-facing hillside. It's almost a textbook example of what you'd want. There was an environmental center there back in the 1980s, which unfortunately caught fire, burned down around the year 2000. So this building sat kind of empty for about 10 years until the genesis to redo this came about 8 years ago. So the idea here is that it goes down that hillside, 3 levels, office space, and you can see in the bottom there that elegant drawing. And water and energy and materials are going to be the 3 key aspects of a living building. Water here, you can see the rainwater catchment off to the upper left. Those photovoltaic panels actually double as water catchment panels. And you have site water as well, and there's a cistern down below. Unlike other parts of the country, to a point that Christine was making, stormwater is a big issue in the Northeast. And of course, we love water, we need it, but when we have too much of it too fast, it becomes a liability. So the idea here is that we're able to store that water and use it for uses, not potable though. LBC allows you to draw that line where the law stands, and then that's the case for us. So there's no question of drinking stormwater. Although your results may vary, other places may be able to do that, but that's not the case for us. Down below is the net energy zero diagram, and you can see photovoltaics, a big array. I think it's a 125 kW array, and then you have geothermal heat wells down below. So when you put all these things on the site, which we were able to use, you've got the building on the bottom, you've got the PV panels up on the top, and they're there for a reason. That's a carport. And so, rather than the typical terrible asphalt parking for your car, here you've got a very nice, comfortable place that's shaded by these photovoltaic panels. And so this is what the building looks like in actual usage, 3 levels sloping downwards. So it's the entrance is up at the main level, so it's very easy to get to, nice views looking out. And the concrete work in front, that stonework is actually sandstone that was done by a local artist. And the idea is that it's beautiful when it's not being used, or it's beautiful when there's a big storm and it's a rainwater garden, and that it celebrates. Since this is the Frick Environment Center, excuse me, it's meant as an education center too. So the idea is that there's kids who come in and out all day, and they get training on, or not training, but classes and lectures and lessons on how natural cycles work. So here's the rain garden to the left. So here it is in a dry condition, and you can see it in action on the right. And then tours, of course. This is something that we put together with the AIA 2030 series. So we had a number of people come through. I've taught classes at Chatham University. This is one of our key places where we go and take people through. There's the PV panels on the left and the cistern. And on the right, you see cars parked under the PV panels. So it's actually a very elegant way to do it. And then here's some of the promotional information of the actual project. So this is outward facing. I think we took this from their website. Second case study we want to give you is the Phipps Conservatory Center for Sustainable Landscapes. This one was earlier, and this one has had much more impact for a number of reasons. If the Living Building Challenge came out in late 2006, it was announced at Greenbuild in November in Denver. January 2007 is when Phipps's visionary leader, Richard Piacentini, decided he wanted to do a living building and approached us to help make this happen. So you can see the Design Alliance emerged as the architect, CJL Engineering, Turner Construction. And so this was a process that ended up being successful, but for a time it was difficult to figure out, because we didn't know what a living building really was. It took a lot of meetings and thinking. Here's a book called Building in Bloom that was written about it. So here's the Phipps. This was built in the 1880s, and to the right-hand side, that dilapidated building, one with the black roof actually ended up being renovated subsequently as another living building. Stay tuned for that, because it's still in the performance period. We just helped it get a LEED Platinum certification, but the LBC is still in the performance period, because you have to show 12 months of actual net zero performance. But it's the white buildings that are just to the left of that ended up being demolished and created the site. This site here was actually the spoils for city dumping oil cans and things like that. So it wasn't a very clean site anyway, in spite of this beautiful southern exposure to one of the city's big parks. The first project I showed you was Frick Park. This one is called Shenley Park. They're related topographically, but they're different different areas of the city. Oops, sorry, I forgot about these things here. That's what have helped. Okay, project site. There you see where we are. Okay, so looking at it now from a straight north-south perspective, the area in gray at the bottom is the project site. And the idea was to make 24,000 square foot office building. Frick, by the way, was 17,000 square feet. I forgot to mention that. Both on 3 levels though, and similar programming. The idea of classrooms, offices, kitchenette, restrooms and things, a standalone building, but the idea is that it's more office space than anything. Frick has classrooms. This one has a conference room. Is probably the only way they would differ. So we started having charrettes early on in the process, and 7 Group was also brought in, and they were very key to having these charrettes. I think Bill Reed is part of 7 Group at this point. But the idea was we had to discuss all of these things. It's how do you take these goals, prioritize them, make them real, make everybody agree on them, and then inculcate them into the design, and then the construction, and then the operations and maintenance. So it took a lot of thinking about how do we kind of reinvent the wheel here. With the integrative approach that we used, we really had a bring everybody, a come one, come all approach. So we had a lot of charrettes with a lot of people, and some of these would last all afternoon or maybe even longer. And you have to really be conscious of your efforts when you realize you have $2,000 an hour sitting around a conference table. When you add up everybody's rates, you have to make sure that it's worthwhile. And so that's where the goal setting becomes very important because you have to be able to track all of these ideas and bring them on to the next if they make sense, or dispatch or eliminate them if they don't make sense. So one of the early principles of passive building, but with active people inside of them. And so the idea was, how do we mass this building? How do we take best advantage of the site? The very simple things, the things that our ancestors knew 10,000 years ago. You work with the natural elements, you work with the sun and the wind, and you try to make a tight envelope. So, try to minimize your loads and work to that. So our early evaluations kind of showed where the wind came from, where the sun was. And then the idea was to back this up against the building. Like I said, this is a hillside. So the idea early on was to berm this project against the building. But then better minds prevailed and thought, we can't berm it up against the building because then you can't get the ventilation and you can't get the daylighting on both sides. So the building emerged as a sort of bar, if you will. So here are the 3 levels, including the rooftop. But the idea is that you have cross ventilation and breezes, but you also have light coming in on both sides. So here's a diagram of the ventilation. The idea is very passive. The cool air that you want comes in at the low, and then the warm air you want to exhausts at the high. And setting wise, you have the idea here that there's a lagoon, a constructed wetland. The project itself was about $12 million. It's about 8 million of that for the building, about 3 million for the site. And of that, what we thought was interesting to share is that mechanical, about 60 to 70% of this ended up being MEP costs. The energy modeling, if you take a look at the blue, that's the project. If you take a look at the red, that's the ASHRAE baseline case. So the blue really performs better than the red in most every instance, whether it's peak heating or peak cooling. And the idea is because you sited it properly and created a tight envelope, letting the outside in when you want it, kind of thing. And that really has paid off. So the envelope's very important. We looked at the double, triple glazed, foam insulation, even phase change materials, which I think are more exploratory than effective, but they do have some impact. So we've had a number of different strategies employed in this building, and they're outlined in the book that I mentioned earlier. Our values are 30 for the walls, R43 for the roof, and the glass properties are much better than conventional, A and B for different types of glazing on the north and the south, comparing that to typical. And so the energy targets, the energy model had an EUI of about 19. Now a lot of talk is about getting to net zero, and even if you're following 2030, right now you're to be 85% or so below the 2005 targets to get to 2030. So a lot of your goals would be around 15 or 20 EUI. Be careful of that, because that doesn't just happen. It's very easy for an owner to say, yeah, I want an EUI of 20. It takes a lot of effort to get an EUI that low. So make sure that your energy modeling follows along. So here, the project itself up high was compared with what an office would have and what a house would have. So it performs, really well. It's essentially the equivalent of about 4 suburban houses. So here's the way the building lays out. This is the roof, green roof looking down. So the long left or right bar is the actual offices. So they get cross ventilation on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, they're bumped up against the vertical circulation. And so here you have the offices on the left, conference rooms on the right, and then you can actually see the sort of circulation at the top. It's a sculptural staircase going up. You got your restrooms against the hillside, which is appropriate. And then you have a sort of kitchenette to the left of that. And then on the first floor, more of the same, but there's a conference room down below. So these diagrams are courtesy of the architect, the Design Alliance. Here's a cutaway section through the atrium to the right and through the classroom building to the left. And you can see the underfloor distribution of air. So air is coming up from underneath, so you have displacement ventilation. And on the right-hand side, it's a 3-story space. Heat is going to rise. Concrete framing is what was decided for this particular project in order to be able to retain the heat. And so there was modeling that was performed for that. So here you have that condition where the office backs up against the atrium. On the left, you see the air comes in and out, or the air goes in and then escapes out the very top of the atrium. So right now in the summertime, that vent is open and it's sucking air out, getting rid of the hot air. In the wintertime, of course, it closes up and there's an insulating blanket, so it actually conserves the heat. Daylight autonomy with a target of 80%. So this was done to show that you don't have glare hotspots like you might if you don't treat the daylight properly, but rather you reflect that daylighting inwards to the space as much as you can. And then computational fluid dynamics was performed on that atrium space. As you can see, it gets really hot near the top, but this is good. This shows the vents being used so that you're pretty much comfortable no matter where you are in the occupiable areas, and the heat rises out the top. And then here you have the laminar flow of air in the transverse section. The vents are operable, but they're automated. So there's no question of accidentally leaving a window open all night or when it's hot. They're on actuators that open and close the windows. If it's okay to open a window and they happen, then they'll open. So it's really a computerized system that will say, okay, temperature is good, humidity is low, it's okay to open the windows, and it will. This was the HVAC unit used, a tri-coil unit. Okay, so here's a diagram that shows the net zero energy, and this kind of puts the components I was just speaking about together. B is the photovoltaic panels. So this array was a little smaller than Frick. That one was 125. This one was about 110 kW. On a couple other buildings, you'll notice the building B at the very bottom, incidentally, that's the exhibit staging center, which subsequently became a living building. So the allocation of PVs, the PVs needed for that building were put onto the carport roof over to the left of the building. So basically we needed to add more PV capacity, as I'm sure you'd appreciate. A on the very left-hand side is the geothermal heat well. And then C is the radiant floor heating, which is done for additional comfort for building users. Water, also very important. So here you have a lot of rainwater catchment, and the idea, Mr. Piacentini had the foresight of previous renovations to say, let's capture this rainwater, even if we don't know what to do with it. It'll go to stormwater. But when we build this building that I'd like to build, meaning this one, we'll have a place to have this stormwater. Well, sure enough, the hillside here provided a place for the stormwater to go. So E is a lagoon. I showed that in the perspective just now. So the water goes into the lagoon. And then K and I are the constructed wetland that takes the black water, because you got to deal with that now, basically from the toilets and the kitchen sinks, and treats that with an anaerobic digestion process. And you have the green roof there, A and B, that also serve to hold water. Green roofs are very effective because they'll hold up to 3/4 of the first inch of a storm and delay it so you don't overwhelm the stormwater system, and you're creating a habitat as well. So here are some pictures of the construction. This is the a lagoon on the left and the top, and the hillside itself being made to accommodate that. And then here's the working greenhouse with the wind turbine on the left, and then the constructed wetland on the right. So you see the tubes coming up. That's for the anaerobic or the aerobic digestion. More photos. There's the radiant system. The photovoltaics. And on the top right, this is what you would need for a living building as well. A lot of education for your contractors. In our case, we weren't so concerned about the big contractor. In this case was Turner. We were more concerned about the subcontractors and the vendors. So we had a pretty elaborate education process in place. Anyone who stepped foot on site was made to understand what it takes to have a living building. That way you don't have that, oh my God, I got to go to Home Depot and get some liquid nails. You eradicate that possibility because everyone understands what it takes. Picture on the inside. of the space on the top right there. And, the actuated windows. And then the standalone photovoltaic panels off to the side facing south. Underfloor distribution there for the office space to the right. And then this is a rendering from Andrew Pogon, the landscape architect, showing the project in its final form. And this is what it looks like now. So this project achieved, other than Living Building, it first achieved the Energy Pedal, then it achieved Living Building Challenge. Prior to that, it achieved LEED Platinum. In fact, it was the second highest score ever given. Also achieved sites certification and well certification. So this is a project that really, really walks the walk. So now, when we talk about at what scale do we act, we have an opportunity to, you have an opportunity to create a highly visible project that can serve to catalyze other training, other models. Part of it is showing what can be done. Sometimes you're on the bleeding edge a little bit. So this is a slide from the U.S. Green Building Council that shows what you can do, or what the role of buildings. So by and large, typical construction, is the way things would be left. If you start on the very left where you have code, maybe 5% of projects are less than code. When someone says, "Oh no, we do everything to code," the way of looking at that is, yeah, if it was any worse, you'd be breaking the law. So to the right of that is conventional building practices, and then you have the market leaders. And then you have the innovators and the risk takers. And so living building projects would be in this right-hand category. Most LEED projects would be in this 20% market leaders. But what has happened here, and this is true to form of how the USGBC has envisioned this, is that LEED projects have forced the state of construction to really expand. And it's not just LEED, California regulations or different technologies available, photovoltaics, have really pulled the entire industry along and made it perform better. So we are actually performing well, but the idea is that you can always do better, and that's where we kind of want to stay. So Christine will make a few comments, and then we'll be open for Q&A.
Yeah, so thanks everybody for sticking with us at these two different scales. I think it's really important to think about infrastructure and building, and hopefully as you're thinking about a building, you're also thinking about neighborhoods and infrastructure. I know we saw some pretty fantastic projects in the design awards, and I'm sure that those projects, those architecture projects, could affect more than just what's on their site. So again, remember, it's all a learning process. We need to figure out how we look at different physical scales, how we think beyond today, and how we think about making an impact larger than just our project in order to shift the systems. So thank you, everybody, for that, and questions and answers.
Yeah, so our next session, so this one is technically done at 10:30, which is 2 minutes, but if Christine and Marc will hang out for a minute, the next session isn't until 10:45. So you'll have a 15-minute break, but if y'all don't mind hanging out for just a little bit, we can do questions and answers during the break. So does anybody have a question?
Hi, yes, I was curious if some of the Living Building Challenge projects that you have worked on have any natural systems incorporated into the interiors of the building as opposed to fully mechanical systems.
When you say natural, do you mean like plant systems, or do you mean
Yes.
ventilation systems?
More plant systems and air filtration, air cleansing kind of systems.
That was, the Phipps Center in particular, and Frick too, both had a sort of strong biophilic vision, where there was nature introduced inside in the form of plantings. And even though the building was a bit sparse at first because it was so concrete heavy with hard, sharp angles, one of the initiatives that was employed was, beta building environments through art. And the idea of not just art suspended, hanging, music, but also plantings that, we're able to kind of just animate the space in a biophilic way, but also provide, fresh oxygen. So, part of the idea was to create a full environment that, that would be pleasing and calming, using biophilic principles. And of course, biophilia is one of the conditions of living building certification, and of course, well certification. So that was incorporated. But if your question is, were we able to rely on systems like that in lieu of filtration? The answer is no. We had to make sure that mechanically the project would perform as if there were no plants in there, because you might not have plants 1 year or something like that. So the mechanical system had to perform as a baseline, and then plants are added in. Some of our well work, incidentally, like with the Cleveland Clinic, we're doing well certification with them. They don't want any plants. Even though plants are lovely and they're healing and they give off oxygen, there's a downside to plants that a healing and a healthcare environment can't tolerate. So you have to be aware of who your client is.
I think, unfortunately, we'd like that to be more prominent, but as Phipps and Frick will tell you, the maintenance of landscapes is its own workflow. And oftentimes organizations don't have that capacity, or you can sub it out. There are definitely, subcontractors who will do it, but oftentimes it's not it's a stewardship budget that isn't part of that project.
If anybody's seen the planter in front of green spaces, I can attest that
It's work.
maintenance can ebb and flow. But it
I
looks
wish
great
we were
right
all
now.
better.
Thanks,
Yeah, I
Dave.
wish we were all better at it.
One of the things
Other
about
questions?
Go ahead.
Morning. From an engineering standpoint, I see ground source thermal wells and water retention. I'd like to know if you're seeing any movement to put those together. I see a large body of water, and I think that'd be a great heat source or a heat sink. But the water source may disappear if you got a dry spell. But still, there's a huge opportunity there that I would see. I just wonder if that's been exploited.
Geothermal, and it depends on what part of the country you're in, but as a basic principle, geothermal makes so much sense because you're able to take the Earth's 55-degree temperature, using it for heat in the winter, using it for cooling in the winter. That's great. On a lot of projects, we try to see if it's possible to have an open source geothermal. Some of these are near the river, or maybe there's an underground river, quote unquote, going by. And wouldn't that be nice? That way you've always got the influx and you don't have the thermal contamination that can occur, if you're not able to get fresh, if you're having to recirculate. What we found in nearly every instance is that if you're looking to have an open source, a geothermal, meaning you're rejecting into a lake or a river or something like that, the amount of filtration that needs to occur offsets the benefits that you would get from it. So in every instance, every geothermal system that we've had has been closed loop.
Other questions? All right. Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Mark. Great presentation. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks, guys. Good luck.
Yeah, enjoy, and keep in touch. Good luck with everything. Thanks.
Yep.
So like I said, we've got a break until 10:45. We've got another couple sessions, so check the program. There's a copy on the table over there if you don't have it on your phone, and enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you. Hey, Christine and Mark. Here, let me move this.
Yeah.
We got the recording started just a little bit late, as you noticed.
Saw that.
So probably not right now, but maybe sometime later this week or next week. I'd love to just get you guys to do that, just that first section that we missed, so that we can add it back to the recording. So we've got.
You're still recording now. Do you want us to just do it now?
Yeah, that would be fine if you want to just start over.
All right.
I don't remember exactly where we started recording, but you guys, if you want to just go ahead while we're
Yeah,
on break.
I know where you were because it's where we transitioned from one speaker to another. So Mark, you just go through
It was
these.
before that. It was well
I,
before.
I seem to remember, yeah, we started, and then when Christine started talking.
Talking,
that's-
yeah.
That's right. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, go
And
for it.
Michael, do we also owe you the learning objectives and everything? Because I don't think we,
That would be great if you have them.
well, we'll create them.
Okay.
We've given something similar to this at Harvard, but they
Yeah.
didn't require it. So I don't know if we ever did, but we can do that for you, Michael. I just
Okay.
didn't want to do it if you didn't need it.
All right. Thank you.
All
All right,
right,
here it comes.
let's
Go
do
for
it.
it.
Okay. All right, welcome everybody. This presentation is called Scale and Performance, and we're going to be talking to you about progressive projects at the building scale and also at the district scale. And these have been pioneering, but the main idea is that they've also had a lot of impact. And so we've been able to leverage that. And this is something that you're going to be looking to do in your own project. It's well enough to have proof of concept and do something meaningful, but it's better when you can actually have ripple effect. Michael gave a nice bio description of us, but Christine and I have been partners for 20 years with our own firm. Both embedded in not just our work, but in teaching and also on advisory boards as well. And our firm is called Evolve Environment Architecture. We're a triple bottom line based firm looking at green building and consulting systems and design. And we're a B Corp certified, we're just certified, we're carbon neutral. We're headquartered in Pennsylvania, but we have a presence in 5 different states. And we look at sustainability from the perspective of what it means to people, the processes that are employed, and place-based sustainability. And a lot of that has to do with sustainability frameworks that we will talk about in this presentation. So in talking about scale and performance, there are different aspects to this, whether it's a physical scale, and we talked about the idea of a space or a building or a campus or a district or a city or a region. We also have time scales where we're looking at the design and construction of a project, but we could be looking at the ripple effects for centuries, not to mention the impact of millennia ahead of us, and as well as scales of influence where we are able to do a successful project, but where you can leverage that and get more benefit, and whether it's as a tourist destination or whether it's changing of law or changing of regulations, and as a result of your project, there can be a lot of scaffolding and leveraging that occurs with regards to your particular project. So when we take a look at different scales, you might have something like an organism here that creates an additional space every time it grows. And then over time actually perishes, but that becomes the habitat for something else, or else it degrades and becomes the feedstock for another process over time. Or you can have the idea of man-made structures that get lost over time because they're ill-conceived. So here's a project in West Africa that was completely forgotten by folks. They just could not withstand the battle against natural forces. And here we have a picture of a young boy playing in a water pit, which is really actually a dinosaur footprint. So the idea here is that we're not alone, no matter how important we think we are. And it's always informative to have the sense of a larger scale at work, whether it's a time scale or whether it's a physical scale or whether it's a scale of influence. And incidentally, this picture here, this is the Tour de France in the 1920s. So these world-class athletes, the best in the world, are smoking cigarettes. In those days, it was thought that if you smoke cigarettes before the hill mountain trials or mountain stages, your lungs and legs would actually perform better. So this was the prevalent thinking back then. And you can throw that into the heap of ideas of, that DDT is a good idea to have around for keep insects away, and asbestos is a great idea in order to keep fireproofing, or redlining is a great idea in order to keep safe neighborhoods. And this is the best we knew at that time, which has obviously been disproven, which is another element of time scale. So when we look at the impact of buildings and districts and region, the idea is not necessarily to just do less bad, like you might have if you're just doing code, or if you're looking to do green, or if you're going to do a high performance building. Oftentimes the comparison is to what would conventionally be done. And if you're able to do less bad, then you're able to claim that you have an element of green because you're saving this and you're doing that. The paradigm here that we want to try to explore with this presentation is how do you actually do positive restorative construction? So it's not just an idea of doing less bad, but doing good with absolute impacts, not just relative ones. So at what scale do we act? Let me turn it over to Christi.
All right, so this is where we already can cut here because I had already done the previous slide. So
As you
I think
wish.
that's it.
Hopefully you got all that, Michael. Uh-oh, did we lose him? It is still recording now.
Good.
Oh, there you are.
All right, guys. Yes, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Looking good there, Michael.
Yeah,
yeah.
thank you. Thanks
Thank
for
you
the
both. Thank you
opportunity.
both so much. I'm
sorry
sorry
we
that we
couldn't
couldn't
be
get you
there.
here in person, but we hope we'll see you again soon.
Exactly.
Another
Thanks so
time,
much.
but, all
Take
right.
care.
Thank you. See ya.